Okay, but thank you for taking time hanging out with us. We're excited to talk with you about the small actions you can take to spark a big change. Today is Giving Tuesday, and we're happy to be giving back to our community by bringing together some wonderful panelists and you, the members of our community, to talk about the benefits of native plants. This event is just the first of a series we're hosting throughout December, and the goal is that with each topic, every participant walks away with inspiration and understanding of ways they can take small actions for our environment. Today's event will be rather conversational, so I want to make sure you have an opportunity to ask your questions along the way. If you have questions while our panelists are discussing the topic, you can feel free to type it in the chat by accessing the chat panel with the icon at the bottom. And when we get to the end, we're going to try to save some time for a Q&A. So we'll welcome you at that time to raise your hand if you'd like. You'll find the raise hand button in the panelist icon. Okay, and I'd like to introduce our panelists now. We have today Dr. John Gelhaus. He is the curator and chair of entomology at the Academy of Natural Sciences. John has expertise in the systematics, biogeography, and ecology of crane flies. He is also the lead PI for the Mongolian Aquatic Insect Survey. Dr. Jordan Teicher is the collection manager of the Academy's Botany Herbarium, which contains almost 1.5 million specimens of plants, algae, fungi, lichens, and even fossils. In addition to caring for the collection, Jordan studies the phylogenetic relationships and evolution of grasses. Tony Crosdale is an environmental education program specialist with Philadelphia Parks and Recreation and an adjunct professor of plant ecology at Temple University. Tony received his BS in horticulture from Temple University and an MS in biology from St. Joe's. Tony will give us some insight into the way Parks and Rec is utilizing native plants to benefit Philadelphia's ecosystems. And Matthew Ross has been the Director of Continuing Education at Longwood Gardens since 2014. He oversees nearly 200 programs annually, including hands-on floral design, ornamental horticulture, creative arts, and innovative online programming that reach students across the globe. We're excited to have Matthew joining us today to discuss how native flora can be utilized in your home landscaping. Before we get into those specifics of planting, let's discuss the problems that native plants are helping us solve. So John, can you give us an idea of what the current situation in and around Philadelphia looks like as it concerns biodiversity in our yards and our outdoor spaces?
Okay, thanks, Katie. So I think it's a kind of an evolving situation. And so let's just talk a little bit about what biodiversity is. So it's all those species out there that are living around us, their genetic variation. And then we need to think about what these communities are that are formed by these species. So we call them the biological communities. And we have those communities in our yard, in our natural spaces, around the world. There are all kinds of different biological communities. Next slide. So there's been a lot of talk about biodiversity being in crisis, and we've known for some period of time that we really are in an extinction crisis across the world, with many species being pushed almost to the point of extinction. And so that has been something that I think most of us are aware of, but we might not think about it so much right here in the Philadelphia area. There's been some recent stories about problems with biodiversity, and it's not just on extinction, but it's on that there is a huge drop in abundance of many different types of organisms. So one that got a lot of recent attention was termed the insect apocalypse. And that was in late 2018, when a couple studies came out that showed severe declines in the abundance of insect species. So that next slide. Right. So, and these were studies not here in Philadelphia, but one was in Germany and one was in Puerto Rico. So two quite different places. And they were looking at the difference in abundance of species and the number of species, but particularly the abundance over 30, 40-year periods. And they found significant decreases in the abundance of insects in Germany and also in Puerto Rico. And when you think about it, these are quite different places, very different climates. So it was really striking to a number of folks why we would see that same pattern show up in studying these two different areas. And both studies tried to link that uh, loss of abundance in insects over those last decades with declines in abundance of organisms that feed on those insects, and particularly the declines in Puerto Rico with the lizards, birds, and frogs. And so that the insect decline in abundance was really affecting other areas of biodiversity. Next slide. And more studies have now come out showing insect declines. One issue, though, is we don't have a single factor that we can point to. And that's what's really perplexing. But many people that study insects had noted or had thought, you know what, it just seems like there are less insects than there used to be 30, 40 years ago. These studies have kind of given us some evidence that those observations seem to hold some weight. But as I suggested, there is no clear single reason. The German study suggested maybe pesticides. The Puerto Rico study suggested that climate change, climate warming, in particularly a place like Puerto Rico, was pushing insects past what they could tolerate, their temperature-wise. Another study suggested light pollution, and it could be that we are seeing these declines from a multitude of factors that have just reached the breaking point for a number of species. Next slide. At the individual level and around here, we can see that with what used to be a very common butterfly around here, the monarch butterfly. And we all know about the monarch because of its spectacular migration, where it moves from developing in areas such as around here, and then in the wintertime, instead of overwintering as an egg, the adults themselves fly all the way to a small area in central Mexico, spend the winter, then they turn around and start laying eggs in the southern US. And eventually we see their progeny, a couple generations maybe from that point, showing up here, maybe May, maybe June, and into July. And so that's a really wonderful migration of this butterfly, really spectacular. But the population of monarchs in the last decades has declined by over 90%. And that's just this one species, but it's a species that we all kind of recognize. And so that is a decline that we can all take as saying, oh, wow, something is going on here. Next slide. And this was of concern enough that it has even been proposed, the monarch butterfly, to be on the Endangered Species Act and listed there because of the huge decline in the population. And in fact, there are two populations that are somewhat separate. One that includes the central and eastern North America that overwinter in Mexico. The other, the West Coast population that overwinters on the coast of California and down that way. That population is almost gone. Now it's declined so much. We still have monarchs, but there is a lot of concern for the future. Next slide. And there's been a lot of concern about declines in pollinators, particularly bees. And some bees, some bumblebees have undergone significant declines. And in fact, the first bumblebee to be placed on the Endangered Species Act is the rusty patch bumblebee that used to occur around here. If we look at that map, you can see those yellow spots. Those are the places where this yellow and red, those are the places where the species has been seen in recent years. All the rest of the area outlined in the black line was where the species used to be. So it used to be around here. It's not anymore. There are also questions why they decline and why decline in some other bumblebee species. But just to go to the fact that there are species that that we used to see around that we don't see very much anymore. So something is going on. Next slide. And we also see that this biodiversity decline in other groups. So there was a big study that just came out on the decline of North American birds. And this was the result of a lot of citizen scientists' observations. Folks like you and me who participate in different bird surveys over the years, like the Christmas bird count and breeding bird surveys and such. And based on 50 years of this data, it was astounding and sobering how much the bird populations have declined, and a decline of over almost 3 billion birds since 1970. So and it hit so many different groups. If this is a fairly complicated thing, graph and such, which I'm not going to go into in detail. But if you look at that middle part with the red, those are all bird groups that have declined. And it's across the board in terms of a lot of seed and insect feeding birds like wood warblers and American sparrows and finches, and even birds that we think of as kind of invasive, starlings, for example, and English sparrows have also undergone significant declines. But not all birds. So the birds in blue, those groups, particularly waterfowl, seem to have increased since 1970. So again, not a super clear picture from birds, but we know some of the major factors for birds are things that we can directly see, such as window kills, birds hitting windows, that kills many hundreds of millions of birds a year. But then there are other factors that we really can't see directly, and that includes loss of habitat and possibly loss of abundance of the food that they feed on. But loss of habitat where they are here in this area, where they migrate and spend the winter, all of those things can bring a big decline over time, but it's something that has to be monitored carefully to be able to pick up those declines. Next slide. So just in the case of birds that feed on insects, so here we have, and how important it is to have native plants and species, native species in our environments. I just put up kind of to show these links here. So if we look on that top left tree there, that's a white oak. It's a Quercus alba is its name. It's a native species, a wonderful species of oak. And there's a study that showed from different records that it supports over 500 different kinds of caterpillars, 500 different species of moths and butterflies feed on white oak in the larval stage. Well, that's pretty significant. Why is that important? Well, those caterpillars not only go on to develop into adult butterflies and moths, but as caterpillars, they feed a lot of other organisms, including nesting birds. Even seed-eating birds feed on a lot of insects while they're nesting and raising their young. And some birds are almost exclusively insect feeding, like this hooded warbler here. So birds require insects as food when they're nesting. So they go to places that have food. And if you've got a native plant, a native tree that's supporting lots of different caterpillars, that's where birds are going to find their food. Now we look at another tree. This is a ginkgo tree. It's a wonderful tree. It's very hardy. It's beautiful in the fall, like you can see. They're commonly planted, but it's not native to the US. And as far as I know, it doesn't support a single species of caterpillar. Maybe it does in its native range in China, but it does not here. And so in that case, in some cases, that's something horticulturists like. There's no pests on the ginkgo, right? There's nothing feeding on it. But in terms of supporting our native biodiversity, our bird populations, and other parts of the diversity, the ginkgo is completely sterile. It offers almost nothing in terms of resources for native biodiversity. So if we plant a lot of things like ginkgo in our environment, instead of the native species, then what we're creating is a food desert for our local biodiversity. Next slide. And here's just pictures from my garden of some of the variety of native caterpillars that feed on native plants. And what happens is you're increasing the biodiversity in your yard when you're doing this just by having all of these species there that are finding something to eat. These are developing into more pollinators, butterflies and moths. I'm just focused on caterpillars here, but we could look at other insects as well. But also these provide more food for other kinds of wildlife. And I'm an entomologist, so I study insects. So my view of the world is very much centered on insects, but I'm a longtime gardener as well. And so this has been a realization for me over time to see that I can, as I add natives into my garden, I'm increasing overall diversity of organisms in the garden. I'm creating this biological community that can thrive and sustain itself. And as a gardener, it's a lot more interesting. I'm not only just getting flowers and plants, but I'm getting all these other wonderful things to look at. Next slide. So our yards can be biological deserts, not deserts, but biological deserts filled with plants that didn't evolve here and don't really sustain wildlife. And if we look around our neighborhoods and we identify those plants that are there, many, if not most of the plants that are commonly put in yards are exotic plants that didn't evolve here and really don't sustain much wildlife. So our whole neighborhoods become pretty much deserted of food for wildlife. But we can fill it with biodiversity by really looking at what native plants and trees we can add to our yards and really fulfill that biological community approach. And we all can be part of this.
Great, thank you, John. You packed a lot of good detail into that short amount of time. Thank you. So Jordan, John touched on this, why the native plants are so important, but from your point of view, what advantages do they provide?
Hi, so I'm slightly the odd man out here in that I'm a horrific, incorrigible plant killer. I have no green thumb whatsoever. Sort of ironic being a botanist. I'm well suited to taking care of the dead plants in the herbarium. But so I thought I would talk about at the sort of even further extreme. So John talked about the lack of benefits that these non-native plants are providing. But even more extreme than that, you have division into plants that are non-native but aren't particularly aggressive, and then plants that are non-native and also invasive. So things like I pulled a couple examples here that if you take a hike through Wissahickon Park, you will see in abundance. It's also a little bit of a chance for a shameless plug for taxonomy. I'm a plant taxonomist. In some of these species, like for example, this Aralia elata, the Japanese angelica tree, is really quite similar physically to devil's walking stick. And so devil's walking stick is another species in the same genus. It is native to Pennsylvania, and looking at a lot of historic records, it looks like it's actually hard to tell exactly when this Japanese angelica tree started replacing the devil's walking stick because they are so similar. So people were reporting saying like, oh, I saw more of this Aralia, the native Aralia. And it's hard to tell unless you actually have some kind of specimen or photographic record. So another benefit of native plants is that they are much less likely to be invasive in the same way. So we do have native species that are good competitors, and they're fairly aggressive if you give them a little bit of an open space. You know, you get these early successional species if you get a disturbed plot of land. But what those native plants don't tend to do is they don't drive out other established existing ones. Some bad ones. I saw a question in the chat, sorry, but I forgot to mention the names of some of these. So burning bush in that top left, Euonymus alatus. This is a really common ornamental plant. It's a gorgeous shrub, especially in the fall. It looks fiery red. And all these species here, I believe, were brought in. I'm not sure about garlic mustard. That might have been accidental. The other three were brought in ornamentally because they're beautiful. They grow really easily in our climate. And then what happened is it's difficult to predict ahead of time whether a species is going to be that kind of aggressive invasive species, or if it's going to be a more mild-mannered stay in your garden. But as John mentioned, you know, even in those cases, a lot of times those seemingly harmless ones are still taking up space from a potentially native plant that could be providing more services. There are some slight exceptions where, you know, especially as we prioritize our removal efforts, where we say, okay, well, yes, that might be a non-native species, but it's so hard to remove, or it's going to be so expensive to remove, we're not going to do it. And it's at least providing some kind of ecological service. Versus in other cases, we say, you know, things like garlic mustard, that's in the bottom right there. It's basically everywhere. There are major efforts to go and pull it out of the ground and treat areas so it won't come back. Especially if you go along the one trail along Lincoln Drive in Wissahickon, you'll see this Japanese knotweed in the top right is all over Wissahickon. So yeah, there's, aside from non-native, you have these different levels of nastiness, I guess, of invasive species that you tend not to get for the natives. And then in addition, these native species are frequently less likely to be problematic for the other plant species. So John mentioned the food resources for native insects, but also native plants have partitioned their habitats sort of between them so that you don't tend to get full monocultures, a totally homogeneous stand of just one native thing, unless it's very, very specially adapted to conditions that nothing else can live in. But like here, if you go and look in Wissahickon, you'll see large stretches of basically just the Japanese knotweed. You'll see large stretches of just a grass called microstegium. I'm blanking on the common name right now. Microstegium viminum. Japanese stilt grass, does that sound right? Anybody recognize it? Okay, yep. So they tend to dominate in a way that native plants don't. And then in some interesting cases, which I have to mention because I'm a grass person, you get even cases where the same species has an invasive version and a native version. So for Phragmites australis, for example, the common reed, it's usually known to a lot of people. It forms these giant monocultures, especially in wetlands. That invasive form is classified as the same species and is kind of difficult to tell apart from a native version, which is sometimes treated as a subspecies, sometimes treated as just a different genetic type of Phragmites australis. And if you have the native one in the stand, it kind of tends to stay where it is. It doesn't exclude other plants. It forms these nice biodiverse communities in wetlands. You get the invasive in instead, and you get basically just Phragmites in that section, which you can see around. If you go to FDR Park in South Philly, around the pond that's there, these big stands of Phragmites. And there you really need to be careful about which one you remove to make sure you're not removing the invasive one. So nobody who brought these things in thought, oh great, this is a hyper aggressive plant that I'm going to bring in and it's going to spread like wildfire throughout all of the communities. So the other real benefit of these native plants is that's very unlikely to happen. They've already been sort of tried and tested in their communities. And yeah, I'd say that's another really positive.
Okay, thanks, Jordan. So Matthew, I want to throw things over to you for a second to kind of talk about, John touched on this, that these native plants can have some really ecological value. And I know at Longwood Gardens, you all are using these plants to not only, thank you, Matthew, not only to add to the beauty of Longwood Gardens, but adding to that ecological value. Can you tell us a little more about that?
Yeah, definitely. And I know many people out there are familiar with Longwood, but if you're not, we're about 1,000-acre botanic garden in Kennett Square. And one of the things we're most known for is our Christmas display, which is going on now, and our fountain shows in the summer. But one thing a lot of people don't realize is that in 2014, we rededicated our 86-acre meadow, which is arguably one of the most beautiful places you'll see anywhere in the country. And it's surprising to many people that this garden is chock full of Southern Chester County native plants. It's an amazing love story between our founder, Pierre, and his passion for environmental stewardship that's been continued on for many years. And in 2014, we rededicated the meadow. So we brought two parcels together to make an 86-acre meadow. And while you'll see expansive beauty in our native flora, juxtaposed both native and non-native plants working together at most botanical garden settings and public garden settings, we, as in Longwood, and also some of our peers, as there's 35 major gardens around Philadelphia, do highlight a lot of the native plants of our region. And it's not just because of the fact that they're gorgeous plants and we have botanical curiosities and we're building a collection, but it's also about giving back to the earth and finding that our birds, our insects, the flora supports the fauna. And in many ways, throughout the year, you get a chance to experience that firsthand by walking through the garden. We also have opportunities to highlight it in artistic ways. So there is a love and it's a passion that I'm seeing become increasingly more relevant. I do a lot of work with Wild Ones, which is a national organization for native plants. And you're seeing people that it's a groundswell of activity into the native plant movement. It started earlier on in the 60s and 70s. Well, then a lot of our native plants actually went overseas to be bred by German, Belgian, Dutch companies because they saw the beauty in what we have to offer in our native plant palette. But we also get a chance to experience not the beauty, not just when it's in full peak bloom, but throughout the year as well. And here we had one of our classes where we actually went out and were surveying what was going on in the property. And right next to where Colin's standing there, we ended up finding a small stream. We caught fish in it. We have a bivalve study that's going on in our ponds that are looking at how the native plants and the management of this meadow actually is helping replenish the quality of the streams nearby through being a nursery for bivalves. So it's a really interesting look when you have this beautiful natural phenomenon, this meadow, and it is a phenomenon because over time this would secede and become a forest if we didn't manage it, that is a manicured garden in many ways. So it sparks curiosity, and you might walk through, John as a gardener or Jordan as a potential plant killer that's going to add to his botanical curiosity collection on paper and their herbarium. There's an abundance of amazing native flora. So you might be inspired and think, what can you do at your home? But or you might go through a tunnel of lights that's currently hanging out in the meadow right now and have that moment, that spark that just drags you into a new direction. And the meadow is fantastic for that. But one of the things that you might not know is that behind the beauty of the 86 acres that we have here is a team of professionals that are going out to maintain what you're going to see. So while it's providing this green sanctuary, this oasis, when John was talking about having a desertification of the landscape, you do have this oasis, the stopping point, and we're seeing species here that you wouldn't necessarily see in your home. But surprisingly enough, if you take something like Liatris or take one of the plants that you see here and integrate it into a established landscape, or maybe you're building a new landscape, you might draw insects and plant life and animal life that you never would have expected occurring in an urban environment. But as I mentioned, it does take a team of professionals. So this was once pasture land when Pierre Dupont had his dairy. And it's with a dedicated team that's going out and doing the work that they need to do to maintain an open meadow. So while you go and experience this amazing garden, it's open, year round, as long as there's not slick ice on the paths, you can walk through the meadow even in winter and see the beauty in what's going on. But it is a team that's out there that's doing prescribed burns, that's doing cutting, that's invasive removal, that is going in and plugging in 160,000 plugs over a 4-year period to build what you're seeing today. And they're out there. It's an evolving process. Gardens evolve, but it's truly at the connection to our environmental stewardship and our mission. But what you might not know about Longwood is that we also do work out in the field. So here we have Peter Zale, who is out in the field working on Cypripedium, and we have a very strong orchid breeding program. And we have opportunities now to utilize the meadow as a place to bring back some of the biodiversity. So the pink lady slippers that you see here, the Cypripedium macauliae, this was a patch that we've now bred and we have offspring from that will be replenished back into our flora at Longwood with the hopes of eventually learning the practices and teaching through science and conservation how other organizations can do this to help our orchid species. And it's not just our pink lady slipper orchids. In the bottom corner there, you'll see a Planetara ciliaris, or the orange fringed orchid, where we're doing work in a corridor to bring this species as well as the white and then the bicolor to the forefront and add them to the floral mix as well. And you're thinking, oh, the meadow's the only place that you're going to see native plants. It's not true. You're seeing native plants all throughout the gardens, from this oak leaf hydrangea here in our orchard throughout the rest of the garden. There's a lot of opportunities. Many of these plants will work at your home. So if you're thinking about that, think big, but then start small. And small, not just in terms of the footprint of what garden you're going to convert or enhance with native plants, but think small in terms of what your propagules you're going to start with. So you could seed a massive area, or you could start with some landscape plugs like what you're seeing here at North Creek, and start with smaller plants to get them established quicker and more bang for your buck. And if you don't have a large space, you could also use many of these plants in containers. So here you have a gardener out there flagging material with native plants and enhancing an established roadside planting. But if you're looking for inspiration, there's a lot of opportunities throughout the gardens in our region. Like Stoneleigh, Mount Cuba Center has an amazing trials program where they're doing active research on what plants are supporting which insects, kind of alluding to what John was answering earlier. Bowman's Hill, Jenkins Arboretum. I encourage you to get involved in Wild Ones or Audubon Society, Natural Lands, the Land Trust, and volunteer. And get growing. Even if it's a container on your own balcony with one plant, I'm sure that if you plant something from our native palette, you'll find another little critter that's going to enjoy it just as much as you, either that being an insect or a larger form of fauna. So I'll take questions at the end, but thank you all for the opportunity to talk.
That was wonderful. Thank you, Matthew. I love seeing all those photos. And Tony, Parks and Rec, you're working on the whole city and benefiting our environment here in Philadelphia with native species. Can you tell us more about that?
Yes, I can. So Parks and Recreation, we have about 10,000 acres of land, 6,000 of which are in natural lands, right? So the rest, would be like the grounds of the art museum or rec centers, playgrounds, median strips, ornamental plantings, what have you. So in the natural areas, so we have, most of that consists of forests, and most of those are associated with bodies of water, specifically streams. So the forest help increase the water quality, right? So they purify the water. And most of that land was actually preserved by the water department and Parks and Recreation, well, at the time Fairmount Park Commission, specifically to stop industry from getting in on those streams and polluting the water. So, we're inherently tied to water quality, right? Parks and Rec used to be separate, Recreation Department and Park Department, and it was called the Fairmount Park Commission, named specifically for Fairmount, where the first reservoir was. So water quality is kind of like the first thing that we do, right? So we have to maintain the health of those forests, and a diverse ecosystem is a lot more robust and resistant to, if it's a diversity of plants is resistant to, if you have a disease, it would wipe out one species if it was dominant. So if you have a diversity of species, you inherently a little bit more robust. Also, with climate change or any other stress. So so that's one of our main things. We also we have meadows, because we used to have a lot of natural disturbance, like beavers, fires, storms, that would have created some open areas within the forest. And since that we don't allow that natural disturbance anymore, we have to replicate that with active management. So that's another thing that we do to maintain an overall diversity. We want a diversity of plants within our forest, but we also want overall diversity, not just within an ecosystem. We want a diversity of ecosystems. So we maintain for that. One thing too is, like, I'm a birder. I got into plants because I wanted a way to support birds without actually handling them. It's not really, most ornithology is misnetting birds or netting birds, and it wasn't really my thing. So I got into plants because it was a way to benefit birds in another way, and then I grew to really love it, and it became like a passion of mine. So you create more bird habitat and more bird food by maintaining the forest, but also I don't want to forget about the plants themselves. They have intrinsic value. Just to people in Philadelphia shouldn't have to drive to the Poconos or out to French Creek or out to the Pine Barrens to see a diversity of native plants, right? So I think that's also like a social justice issue, right? The wildlife and the plants should be accessible to the public, and we have a duty to make sure that we retain that diversity so people can actually enjoy wildlife and plants. Another thing we do is we have a nursery. So for the plantings, the restoration projects, as well as the ornamental plantings, and the stormwater projects that I'll get to in a minute, we actually grow a lot of our own plants. Although those projects are so big, we actually have to purchase a lot from other nurseries, but we actually do have our own nursery. So we do research. So in Haddington Woods, for instance, we are actually experimenting with installing more southern species, because climate change is happening faster than the natural lives of plants, right? So it's trees that might live hundreds of years. So right now we're on the edge of like sugar maple, but we might lose the range of sugar. Sugar maple might not be able to live in Philadelphia in another, 50 years, 100 years. So we're looking at, white pine, for instance, too. So we're looking at other species like longleaf pine, bald cypress, southern red oak, that so that way we can install those plants and they actually have a better chance of existing in our area, because we're kind of right on the edge of the north and south. So that's another thing we're doing. I'm an environmental educator, so we have all three of our environmental centers have demonstration gardens, as well as two of us have food forests with the Philadelphia Orchard Project, so we can demonstrate the benefits of native plants, pollinator gardens, what have you. We work closely with the water department for stormwater control. So Philadelphia has combined sewers. So our city was not, our stormwater system and our sewage system was not designed for this much development. It was designed when the city only had a few 100,000 people. Now we have 1.6 plus 7 or so million in the general area. So we get so much more stormwater than our system can handle. So rather than replumbing the whole city, the water department is installing a lot of structures to like rain gardens and tree trenches to stop that stormwater from getting into our system and overwhelming it, and therefore releasing sewage into our streams and rivers. So and a lot of that is on Parks and Rec land, and we also grow a lot of those plants in the nursery. And then we do street trees. So you can go, Parks and Rec will give you a street tree, you can apply to it. Also, Parks and Rec through Tree Philly supplies yard trees, and most of those are native, although some are fruit trees, but most of the trees that we give away for free are native. And we do an urban agriculture program. Now, most of that is, crops, but generally we'll also encourage native plants for the pollinators. And then, of course, beauty. So, the azalea gardens, the river drives, all those ornamental plantings are from Parks and Rec, and we put a lot of native plants in there to, for the benefits of biodiversity and also as pollinator corridors. So, yeah, Parks and Rec has its hand in a whole lot of different aspects of providing and enhancing and maintaining native plants in Philadelphia.
Yeah, that's great. And, great information there for people to take advantage of as well. So thank you, Tony. I'd like to bring the conversation back to kind of those practical steps that everyone here could take to get started in planting. So I'll open this up to discussion with all of our panelists, but Matthew, would you mind kicking us off? What are those most important recommendations that someone like me can use to start incorporating natives into my yard and like you said, balcony, patio, those small spaces? What are your best recommendations for that?
Well, great question, Katie. And I know many of you are probably thinking the same thing, like, how can I get started? And I think the best thing to do to get started is to get acclimated to what the native flora is and what you're looking to do in your garden. So starting off with like a design intent. Do you have a small garden and you want to bring in X, Y, and Z? And if you want to bring in this bird, I'm sure John could tell you what insects they eat and tell you which host plants of those insects would make good landscape plants. The other thing that I would highly recommend is getting involved in organizations. So if you're really interested in getting started in natives, Wild Ones is a good organization. They have a budding chapter that's just starting up in southeastern Pennsylvania. So if you're local, that's one opportunity. And then talk to people that have grown natives. So either reach out to fellow gardeners or people in those organizations and say, what has worked for you? I could give you a list, but the list is going to change based on where you're at and what your goals are. Katie, you mentioned having patios or having a deck. Then I would pick what's most charismatic, what's most fun for you. So, Tony was talking about the pine barrens, and if you've never seen the pitcher plants in the pine barrens, it's one of the coolest things in the world. And if you want to get someone interested in native plants and you're like, oh, here's a native plant that, if you set up a little bog container, they can grow pretty easily. And it's pretty awesome, and then I know the milkweed movement's really strong right now. So there's a lot of different milkweeds that you can grow to help support monarchs. Now, one of the things you're going to have to think about when you're making a transition into native landscaping is that you might not be the only one that's appreciating your plants. So if a couple of those leaves get nibbled up, or you wake up the next morning and all the stems are bare, that's not a bad thing. That means that somebody else is enjoying them. And I'll encourage you to kind of learn from others' mistakes and learn from others' successes. So getting connected with an organization, going to a public garden like Longwood, Mount Cuba, Stoneleigh, Jenkins, and seeing what works and finding one that's hyper local to you is one way to get started.
And
That's great.
just to follow up on Matt's point, when you are designing your community like this, your yard, you need to change your focus. You're not trying to grow the most perfect plant. You're trying to grow a plant that is sustaining itself, but also sustaining other organisms. So you have to share that plant. And so that means you're not dosing it with a ton of pesticides. You're not making it so it's completely inaccessible and a sterile plant in the system, but it's a plant that's being used by other organisms. And so chewing on some leaves, to me, it's like, oh, let me look and see what's using this plant right now. And, sometimes it can be a little aggravating when the plant really gets chewed up, but many times it's just you're looking and you're seeing all these great organisms.
Yeah, John, I have to say, one of our events we did early in the quarantine with you, you had mentioned that, plant more than you need for your garden. I'm a vegetable gardener. And I was a lot less bitter about finding those creatures that do chew up my plants this summer. After you just saying that, I'm like, you know what? That's a great point. Like, I'm not going to eat every single thing that's in this garden. So if some other creatures benefit, that's great. So thank you both for pointing that out. So beyond just asking our other panelists here, what their advice for getting started, I want to mention, feel free to ask your own questions here. If you do want to raise your hand to ask a question directly, it's in that participants panel. You can open that up and click the raise hand button. That'll just let us know that you have a question and we can unmute you. But in the meantime, do any of our other panelists have other recommendations? Actually, we do have a question here from Amber that just came in the chat. How do you know that creatures are beneficial, though? So obviously there are invasive species of insects and other animals. So
Here, how do you know if they're beneficial or not? Well, I guess the first thing would be to try to identify them. And right now we're at a point where there are a lot of great tools for identification that we didn't have 5-10 years ago. So a lot of neat apps for your phone to help you identify what plant you have, what insect you're seeing, what bird is in your yard. And I'm teaching a course in identification right now at Drexel. And so my students have been using all of these different tools for identification. And it's been really helpful for them to figure out what they're seeing. So I think the first thing is, see if you can load a couple apps or put things on your computer, share your photos. Yeah, here are just some of the ones to think about. If, iNaturalist is one that's very good for particularly the plants and animals we see around us. There's another one, and these you upload a photo and it has an automated identification system, which gives you a set of suggestions to help you to start to figure out what you're looking at. Picture this is another one that's, I think, more horticultural emphasis. There's Merlin for birds. There's Bug Guide for insects. And then there are these Discover Life guides of various kinds, including for wildflowers and such. And that can be a first good step to starting to figure out what you're seeing. Then you can go online or in field guides or other books and read more on the organism and find out whether this is something that you want to encourage in your yard or not.
thanks, John. Great, and great question, Amber. Thank you for that.
There's a question earlier, Katie, if you don't mind me hopping on.
Yeah, please.
I did respond in the chat, but a question about nativars and the use of ornamentals that are not native. And one of the things that I encourage people is not to have guilt. If there's a plant that you love and it's not going to do something deleterious to the environment, go for it. And, like for instance, many people were talking, John was talking, you were talking about being a vegetable gardener. There are some non-native plants that do support life. Like for instance, if you're going to raise swallowtails, like I know we did in my vegetable garden this year, planting things with the Apiaceae or like dill and fennel can help swallowtails. So don't have guilt if you want to have a couple things that aren't necessarily native. There's a lot of research that's going on right now. So Doug Tallamy came out with a second book after bringing nature home. Well, I mean, he has several books, but after bringing nature home, that really kind of articulates that. And there's been discussion about, at what threshold of native plants do you have to have within your garden to be able to support a native ecosystem? And it's not 100%. You don't necessarily need every single thing to be native, And there's work by Annie White. She used to be at University of Vermont. She's doing a lot of work on the relationship between nativars and the insect world. Mount Cuba Center and Hockessin, Delaware is doing similar work as well. So, get involved and see what's out there from a research standpoint, because you'd hate to make a blanket statement that you would carry on. There's no absolutes in gardening. There was some, even John, the one photo you had, I think it might have even been Dill that you had the swallowtail on.
Right.
There are some that are not so highly specialized to our native flora. With that being said, the pictures that Jordan had, I'd encourage you not to have many of those plants in your garden. So
right.
Answer that question. And Jordan, I don't know if you want to talk any more about that.
Well, I was just going to follow up. I think it gets confusing sometimes. There's nothing magical about a native plant, and even how you define a native plant can vary. But the reason that it's always a good idea to err on the side of as native as possible, or as native as is, maximally convenient, is because they have been evolving here. And that's what makes all these properties. So like in some of these situations where in some nativars, you don't lose the support for the habitat, but in others you do. The reason is it might be a very, very minor biological, or seemingly minor or small biological process that plant has in the native one versus the nativar that has put the pollinator off. We don't really quite know what the difference is, for example, between invasive Phragmites and native Phragmites that makes the invasive one so invasive. So in some cases, it's a little bit difficult to predict ahead of time to say, oh, this is going to be a substitute, this is not going to be a substitute. And so that's why we say, like, yeah, the more native you can make it, the better, but not all non-natives are equally horrific. Try really hard to stay away from the really, really bad ones, because some of them can have really, some of them are, at this point regulated where you may not plant them. Other things are kind of surprising that they're not regulated, given how widespread they are and how quickly they spread. So it is worth your time to do a little bit of research, at least for that. And if you see a plant, like happened with my father recently, the number one thing, he's like, oh, I need a shrub. I love burning bush. And I was like, please, just not that one. Like, I will give you a list of 15 other things that look at least almost as good, that wouldn't be so bad. So yeah, things in that direction. I also saw a question about plants being deer resistant that are native. That's going to vary by the plant. Mostly the deer also evolved here. So they can eat a lot of things. I think it's pretty tough to get a really deer resistant plant. A lot of them are going to be fairly deer tolerant, of that they've also evolved to tolerate a certain level of herbivory. But yeah, maybe one of the more gardening types can talk about what they do to protect from really destructive native species.
Tony, is that something that you guys encounter with the Department of Parks and Rec, just with our large deer population within the Philadelphia region? How do you sort of combat, the balance between native plants and the beautiful landscapes and the detrimental destruction that deers bring?
Yeah, well, right now we're having a deer cull. I would be very transparent about that. If you see orange signs that say park curfew, that is because sharpshooters from the USDA are thinning the deer population. And it's I love deer. I also love eating deer personally. But they I derive a lot of pleasure from seeing deer. But it's we don't have mountain lions and wolves have been extirpated from our area. Plus they probably couldn't exist in the small places we have. So they're either going to die of starvation or they're going to die on the road. So, and this way, like that, if you like, shrub foraging warblers, things like wood thrush, birds that forage at eye level. If you have too many deer, they're not going to have any food. It's going to, you could see a line about 6 feet tall where a deer can reach. There's nothing underneath that. So what Parks and Rec does is we have huge areas where we've excluded deer with deer fence. So besides deer culling, we also have that, and any planting we go in, we generally deer fence it to get the trees a certain height, because the bucks will, when their velvet starts to come off, it's very itchy, and they'll rub it off on the on any small tree, and they'll shred them and girdle them. So we have to protect. We have to protect them. So we use deer fencing, and we do a deer coal.
Great. Let's see. I'm sorry. I'm checking here to see if we had any other questions. Oh, any educational books or article suggestions? Matthew, I think you mentioned an author.
Yep, and they followed up right in the Sue Evelyn, whoever you are, said Nature's Best
great.
Hope, Doug Tallamy's new book. Heather Holm is an expert on bees and wasps and vespids. So when John was talking about the rusty patch bumblebee, she's got some great books out there. My advice to you is that if you're looking for scientific articles, talk to Jordan. If you're looking for insects, talk to John. And if you're looking at, the landscape, Tony and I probably know a little bit different resources as well. But getting involved in an organization that's actively doing research and looking at who's doing research on the topics that you're most interested in is probably one of the ways to help guide you. And I know A&S, you guys have a lot of resources as well. I think it's not just about reading. I think it's about doing and being involved. So volunteering with one of the organizations that we mentioned, calling up Tony and getting a tree, which I think is an amazing program. That's awesome. And going out to the parks and going out to gardens and seeing what's happening and kind of opening up your eyes to what's out there. Befriending people in the native plant community is one of the best things, because you might not even need to buy the plants. They might come to you. And there's nothing more gratifying than taking something that you brought from seed and having it go all the way to seed and then sharing that seed with somebody else. And Jordan, I know that we're gonna turn your thumb green one of these days. But
every time John will frequently have cuttings and seedlings and things from his garden, and every time I'm so tempted to come and get them, but I just know that I'm going to kill them so fast.
Exactly.
I let other people have their take first.
Yeah, Caitlin and I both benefited from John's generosity this summer. So I have milkweed out, and yeah, that's a great point, Matthew.
And what Rita said about seed wild collecting. Definitely don't want to wild collect. Your best bet is to, again, get involved with one of the organizations with people that are interested in native plants. And you can gather seed from somebody's yard way more effectively, way more environmentally friendly than going out and doing wild seed collection. A lot of it's actually against the law, depending on where you're at. But making those connections. So it's beyond the reading, start a book club, get involved. If you want to talk about Nature's Best Hope or another book that's out there that you're interested in, it's an active practice. So gardening, getting involved with native plants is an active practice.
And I'll mention, some plants will just come to you on their own. So I have 3 species of goldenrod that all came into my yard. They're all native. They have different levels of being aggressive, but they're wonderful for pollinators. And I have 2 species of native white asters that came into my yard, panicled aster and the small aster, white aster. They're great. I love them. But I didn't collect the seed. They came in, but I recognized them as something interesting and watched how they grew and have moved them around to certain areas in the yard. So I think paying attention to what is growing around, trying to identify it and figure it out is great.
I think those plants knew to come to you, John. They felt safe there. All right. Well, thank you all, our panelists. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us today. I know I'm walking away with a lot of inspiration. A lot of my questions answered, so I hope everyone else is feeling that way too. If you do think of a question that you would like to pose to any of our panelists or just to ANS in general, use our email address. It's membership@ansp.org. membership@ansp.org. And we'll direct your question. We're very happy that people are interested in this topic. And so we're very happy to answer any questions you have. So send questions our way and we'll share. But thank you again, everyone, for joining us, spending this last hour with us. I had a lot of fun. I hope you did. And I hope we'll see you at our next Spark Change event. You can see the whole list of upcoming events and you can register on our website. It's ansp.org/sparkchange. All right, anything else from our panelists? You just want to say goodbye?
Great
Thanks for
question.
having me.
Thanks for having us. Yeah.
Thanks,
Yeah.
everyone.
Thank you.
Have a great
Cheers.
evening.